So if you haven't finished Mafia the Old Country, you probably want to click off this video because we're going to go into some major spoiler territory. And that's because I want to talk about the potential connection between Mafia the Old Country to Mafia 2 and maybe Mafia 3. Now, if you already have gotten somewhat through the game, you know that Leo Galante from Mafia 2 is a big feature in this game, as he was in Mafia 3. However, that's not the connection I want to talk about here. The connection we're talking about starts with the very end scene of the game, which is Isabella landing in Empire Bay. Well, we know Empire Bay is the featured city for Mafia 2, but where am I going with this? Well, as I'm watching this final scene, I'm kind of slowly putting the pieces together. We have a pregnant woman who kind of resembles Joe Barbaro landing in Empire Bay in 1907. So basically what I'm getting at here is Isabella potentially related to Joe Barbaro? We already know as Mafia fans that the writers love to mess around with the Joe Barbaro lineage here. So this isn't totally, crazy to theorize with. Now, your first thought might go to, does that mean Isabella is Joe's mother? Does that mean the baby she was carrying was Joe? No, it's not Joe, which is the interesting part about this whole theory. Because if we look at Joe's birthday, it's 1924. This is way off from when Isabel first announces in the game that she's pregnant. So it couldn't be Joe being born. However, if we do a little bit of math, if we calculate the numbers and all that, we see that Isabel probably gives birth in 1907 to her child. And by the time Joe is born, Isabel's child would be about 17. Now, what do we know about Joe's upbringing exactly? Because I know damn well everyone knows that they didn't really talk about his parents too much at all, actually. There was no mention of Joe's parents. What we do know is when Vito was growing up with him, they would get into a lot of shit. They were troublemakers. They did a lot of crimes together. They were just trying to earn a buck, So what that tells me is that Joe's lifestyle growing up was in poverty. And what does poverty, equate to? Rough home life, probably no home life at that. So my theory is that at 17 years old, Isabel's, what I would guess, daughter had Joe Barbaro at a very young age, couldn't afford to keep him, and gave him away to someone else, or maybe for an adoption. But let's talk about resemblance again. I think a big giveaway for a lot of these connections made with Joe Barbaro is through the nose. I think everyone sees that distinctly. That's the first thing everyone notices, especially when they notice Lincoln Clay had a certain resemblance to Joe. It was definitely the nose. Isabella, I think, definitely shares that same type of nose, but it's also the strong eyebrows as well. That's a key feature in this family tree that I've also noticed. But guys, it's not even Isabella that we want to focus on here when it comes to facial features. It's her father. Don Torrisi looks exactly like Joe Barbaro. You put these two next to each other, especially Mafia 3 Joe, and you cannot tell me these two are not related. They look exactly the same, facial structure and all. And to me, it's not even just about them looking similar. It's also about the personality, because I do think Don Torrisi shares similar personality traits with Joe. And you're probably asking me, Johnny, what personality traits could these two have in common exactly? Guys, it's the temper. The anger. What's one common thing you notice with Joe's personality in Mafia 2? He definitely has a strong temper. Don Torrisi also has a strong temper, but you don't notice it immediately. And that's because as a boss, as a Don, Torrisi is so accustomed to suppressing his emotions. You see that throughout the game's story. He's very calm when he's telling people stuff. And it's almost scary. It's almost like you can sense that he's bottling up a lot of anger, and you don't want to see him when he's angry, so you just go along with what he says. Towards the end of the game, when you have to fight him, and the thing with his daughter comes into play. You see that side of him, that uncapped anger, that temper that he holds back throughout the entire game. And when he starts acting like this, I can't help but draw correlations between, you know, the temper that Joe had in Mafia 2 as well. But let's take a step away from Don Torrisi and Joe Barbaro for a second here, because there's more family members in this family tree to really draw correlations to. Let's talk about Isabel and Lincoln Clay. What is the personality trait that shines strongest through in Isabel's character? Guys, she's rebellious. And if you go all the way down in the lineage, the family tree, to the 1970s with Lincoln Clay, you see what I'm getting at here. Both of them are super rebellious. I think this is not a mistake. I think this is like some DNA thing going on here in the family. There's definitely some traits being passed down here, man. And I think the writers are subtly hinting at things like this. I wouldn't put it past the writers to make this correlation, also for the simple fact of dramatic irony, because the lineage, really the earliest part of the lineage, starts with Don Torrisi, the big boss, you know, head of the mafia, the origin of the mafia. And then all these decades later, you go down the line of the family tree, and it ends with Lincoln Clay, the complete opposite, someone who destroys the mafia, something I bet Isabella would have wanted to do during her time. You know, it's not a coincidence. This is definitely a story being told here through several games without implying it directly. You go from one of the biggest mob bosses in the Mafia series that we have seen up until this point to someone at the end of the lineage destroying the mob. Like I said, not a coincidence, guys. I think it's also very poetic in the writing where Don Torrisi says to Enzo at the end, you know, you can't change who you are.
Look me in the eye. You can't change. I tried.
I feel like Don Torrisi changed after his wife died and, you know, secretly wanted to change for the better, you know? I feel like he was projecting onto Enzo, like, you can't change because I've tried to change and it didn't work. And all those years later, down the family line, you do see that change. You see a difference. You see Lincoln Clay doing things differently, although, you know, depending on how you end the game, I guess you could say, in Mafia 3. But there's definitely a change. There's a change there. So I think Mafia: The Old Country adds a huge piece to the story being told with Joe's family tree here. And it's very interesting. I think Joe's like family ties is probably the most interesting part about the Mafia series currently. But at the end of the day, this is just a theory. I could be totally wrong, man. Maybe the developers are going to come out and say something else, you know, and make a different connection. But this is what I think is canonical here. This is what I think makes sense. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. And thank you for watching the video.